Mark Joseph, and thanks for joining us for another edition of the program. Well, today we have another special guest who is joining us. He's usually behind the camera, behind people like evangelist Dr. Billy Graham, Rick Warren, and so many others, but today he's in front of the camera, and his name is Larry Ross, and he's our guest. Thank you, Larry, for joining us today.
Hey, Mark. It's good to be with you today.
So, Larry, first of all, how would you describe what you do? You're more than just a publicist. You're a media strategist. You help people plan their public persona. Tell us about what that's like.
Right. I have a team of about 15, 16 professionals in Dallas, Texas, an agency, and I like to describe what we do as operating at the intersection of faith and culture, providing crossover communications, either out of the church community into the mainstream or vice versa. You and I had opportunity several years ago to work with Mel Gibson on The Passion of the Christ.
I produced the CD and you did the publicity.
Particularly into the faith community. And so it works both ways, but we try to help many times Christian organizations, ministries, people who are doing work in relief and development, church leaders, what have you, or other organizations, tell their story in the context of traditional news values that the media need in order to communicate to their audience.
Now, do you always work with religious organizations or groups?
Not exclusively, primarily, but we've gotten involved in a number of other different projects. Often the work that we do comes either in the area of religion or out of relationship that I would have with someone. Often it's someone who may be running a secular mainstream company, but they happen to have a personal faith, and so they do it on Christian principles, and so that becomes a value-added part of their story. But the principles are the same regardless, and I cut my teeth years ago. First started with the General Motors Corporation out of Detroit, traveled nationally representing the corporation in the media, then worked for a big firm in New York City for several years where, among other things, I had the opportunity to handle the media positioning for Joe DiMaggio. And so I went from Joe DiMaggio to Billy Graham, now working with Pastor Rick Warren and a number of others. And it's been, to me, very fulfilling to have a professional involvement in working with some of these organizations where the product isn't selling soap, and there's nothing wrong with that. I did a lot of it in my career, but the product has changed lives. It makes it a lot easier to get out of bed in the morning.
Now, your job obviously is to make your client look good. Do you have to minimize their sort of defects, if you will, if they're a product, maximize what's their strengths? Do you have to sort of deceive the audience? I mean, how does this work?
No, not at all. I'm a firm believer that public relations, media relations, can't make black white. We can reframe the picture if there's a misunderstanding about an individual or an organization, but we're not about manufacturing an image in any way. Often what we are called to do is project an identity that already exists. But it may be an individual or organization that's either misunderstood or below the radar, not known. When we start working with a group, we often ask three questions. First of all, who are you and what do you do? And that's pretty easy to describe and define. But secondly, how are you perceived by the public, by your constituency? And then thirdly, what's the difference? Because the difference between who an individual or organization is and how they're perceived is often the communication gap that needs to be filled, which we can do through publicity and promotion. And often it comes out of relationship, working with reporters to help them understand what the news hooks are that are of interest to their audience.
So tell us about the association with Dr. Billy Graham. When did that start? And it would seem to me this is a guy who almost doesn't need any PR help. Everybody loves him. He never says anything crazy. So how did that come about, and what were your issues with him?
Well, interestingly, I grew up in Wheaton, Illinois, and the house that I grew up in as a kid actually had to be raised or moved to build the Billy Graham Center on the campus of Wheaton College. And then now years later, I've worked the last 26 and a half years, I've had the privilege of working with Dr. Graham. And so I grew up where he was a well-known and favored son of the school that I ended up going to myself, Wheaton College. I graduated back in the mid-'70s. And went to work, as I mentioned, for the General Motors Corporation in secular public relations. But in the early 80s, I really felt like I was getting great experience, but wasn't doing anything for anybody. I was just, didn't feel like I was, the things I was involved with didn't really matter. And I, through a series of circumstances, had an opportunity to add a public relations dimension to the work that the agency of record for Mr. Graham and his ministry were doing in the area of advertising and television production. At that time, Mr. Graham was getting a lot of requests from the media to interview him and to cover his ministry. So there are really two different ways we work. One is responding to media inquiries, and the other is to proactively go after media coverage, which we might do in a crusade setting. But really it was a matter of helping to add a professional dimension to the fielding the media requests that Mr. Graham was getting at that time. And you're right, Mr. Graham doesn't need any help in terms of name recognition. He himself is, I think one of the distinctives of his ministry has been his ability to make positive points for the gospel in any media situation. And God has honored his faithfulness in that regard. I remember talking to him one time when he was at a mainstream network TV studio just like this, and we did a sound check. And when I was in the corporate world, corporate executives would either count to 3 or say what they had for breakfast for a sound check. Mr. Graham always quotes the Bible verse, John 3:16. And I asked him one time why he did that, and he said that every time I go on television, I try to get the gospel message in. But he said, if I don't, at least the cameraman heard it. And seeing him up close and personal, the thing that's really been encouraging to me is there aren't two Billy Grahams. The person that you would see in a stadium or watch on television is the same one you talk to one-on-one. That he really does match his walk with his talk, if you will. That's been a real example to me.
Now, you lived through this sort of explosion of religious media. We have a pastor from Texas who's now a best-selling author, and of course, Rick Warren. What are your observations? What thoughts do you have on the mixing of church and media that we've seen over the last 30 years?
Well, it's been an interesting transition. You know, when I first started, I think back to the negative headlines in the mid-'80s with Baker and Swaggart, when religious leaders were almost caricatures in the media. And during that time, we worked to separate Mr. Graham from the other so-called televangelist. For Mr. Graham, he is an evangelist who's on television, but his ministry is in the stadium, not the studio. For him, television was an extension of his ministry, not the essence of it. And I think we were able to separate what he did from some of the others and maintain the authenticity that he's had through the years. And yet we've now come full circle where I think media in recent years have awakened to the importance of spirituality and faith in people's lives. Perhaps it's things like the Passion of the Christ and other things that have gotten on the radar, gotten into the drinking water, if you will, of our culture. But I've really been encouraged that the media have started to cover religion in a positive way. Fox News Channel now has a religion reporter, if you will. Many newspapers have that beat, and they're giving more attention to it. And yet we still find ourselves, when we're dealing with a general assignment reporter, it's more of an education process than an information process, helping educate them on the terms that an epistle is not the wife of an apostle and things like that. But it's really, to me, I find that very fulfilling. And while I have to remain professional, I don't ever want to look past the microphone to the person's audience to recognize wherever someone is at in their own spiritual journey. And I've had many opportunity to have many deep conversations with producers and reporters, obviously waiting until they ask me. But I can't tell you how many times people have said, do you believe this stuff, or is this just a client for you? And it's been, I find for these ministries, it's not ancillary or add-on, but what we do in helping to extend the impact of an organization or the influence of the principle is every bit as much ministry as what they're doing in the rest of their work. Let me give you one example. Years ago, Mr. Graham had a crusade at the Meadowlands in New Jersey. And he announced on the first night that later in the week he was going to speak on loneliness, which is the most oft-requested topic for him to speak on. And so I called the local paper and I gave him a heads up to suggest, why don't you send a reporter out to do a story on the sermon because of how relevant it is to their audience. So they did, and the next day there was a story on the front page of the paper quoting huge chunks of Mr. Graham's sermon. And a young man who had never been to church a day in his life, didn't know anybody who did, recognized himself in that article. And he pulled out the yellow pages, found the closest church to his house, and called and asked to speak to the pastor. And the pastor happened to be a counseling supervisor at the crusade. They talked for an hour, and he led that man to a faith commitment at the end of that conversation. So for him, the newspaper article became a crusade for him. And that's really what I find fulfilling, is to extending the impact of these organizations through the media.
Okay, we'll come back in just a moment with our guest, Larry Ross. Stay tuned. We are back with our guest, Larry Ross. And Larry, I still want to get at this idea of the public fascination with religious leaders. This is a pretty uniquely American characteristic. I travel around the world. I turn on the TV in Japan. There's no Buddhist leaders on TV. What is it about the American character that gravitates toward not only religious leaders, but now religious leaders on television, in books, and really what Dr. Graham's been doing all these years?
Well, I'll tell you, I think it confirms what Dr. Graham has often addressed as a search for purpose and meaning that he finds everywhere he goes, especially among young people. While he is no longer holding crusades, the last several years of his crusade ministry, he had a youth night on Saturday night, which you're familiar with. He would take high energy music from contemporary Christian bands and combine it with a message from the Bible. And he was setting stadium records of up to nearly 100,000 people at these arenas and stadiums, of mostly teenagers. So to me, that's a man bites dog, to have a stadium full of teenagers coming to hear a 80-something man with Parkinson's preach a sermon from the Bible. And yet, when you think about this generation, all the institutions that you and I relied on growing up have let them down. There's a high divorce rate. With Columbine, you can't even go to school and feel safe anymore. And so for Mr. Graham to come and have this authenticity, we would try to say, Mr. Graham, it's youth night, wear a golf shirt. He'd show up in a suit and tie and say, this is who I am. And the authenticity of that really resonated with them. And so I really think that people are on this search, and I think we've seen it intensify post 9/11. And but it's gone beyond television programs. Rick Warren, right here in Southern California from Saddleback Church, has really feels strongly that the church has become a talking head. The Bible calls the church the body of Christ, and what he's trying to do is attach arms and legs for a practical demonstration or application of that faith, and mobilizing people to go around the world in missions. And I think that too is resonating, as people are wanting to not only what Rick calls a reformation, a second reformation, not of belief, but of behavior, not of creeds, but of deeds. And I think that's where we're seeing, what excites me about what I'm seeing the church moving for in the days ahead.
So you spent 25 years with Billy Graham?
It's actually been 26 and a half and still going. Dr. Graham turned 89 on November 7th, and while he's no longer preaching, he's writing another book and has opportunity from time to time to speak. And I got to tell you, the lion still has a roar, and while it's harder for him to move from point A to point B, when he gets up to speak, it's amazing the power that still is in his preaching. 2007 was a tough year for him. In June, he lost his wife of 63 years. She was not only a marriage partner, she was his ministry partner. And Ruth Bell Graham was her name, and was really a very vital part of his ministry, and a student of the Bible, and together they really had an impact around the world. She kept the home fires burning, but really was a support to him. And I think he's dealing with the loss of his wife, but doing so in the crucible of public observation. And I think as he buried her, he's helped people live all these years. He and his wife showed people how to die, and with dignity. And yet I think he's buoyed these days by periodic visits from his family, and the prayers of so many people.
And now you're also working with Rick Warren,
Right.
who is the author of The Purpose-Driven Life, 32 million copies in print. What is your work with him, and how are you bringing your expertise over the years into his work?
Well, Rick Warren is an interesting, it really parallels Dr. Graham, but his growth, his rise to public awareness was a little different path. Dr. Graham, the media was a big part of his ministry from the start. Rick Warren, on the other hand, while well known in the Christian community, for 23 years was not known outside the church. But this book, The Purpose-Driven Life, just exploded him onto the scene, not only in the U.S., but around the world. He had to deal with what he calls the ministry of influence and affluence, and has done so very admirably in setting up foundations, giving away 90% of the money he made from the sales of that book. He's now mobilizing the church, what he wants to generate 1 billion foot soldiers, he says, and going to slay the 5 global giants of illiteracy and poverty and sickness and corrupt leadership. And he's doing so by mobilizing people out of the church to redefine missions around the world. But I think that from our perspective, the opportunities that came to Dr. Graham and his generation are now coming to Rick Warren as pretty much the quintessential go-to media guy. And the phone just ringing off the hook of people who want his opinion of how spirituality and faith apply, putting the gospel in a cultural context, if you will. And he's got a real gift in how to do that, speaking on a variety of issues.
Now, do you advise your clients on sort of theology or religion or content, or is it strictly about how they present themselves?
Yeah, I look at it in the Bible, in the Old Testament. God gave Moses the vision for the tabernacle. This is a story in the Old Testament that would resonate with the Jewish community, with the Christian community. But Moses didn't have to build that tabernacle. God raised up 2 craftsmen, and I forget their names, Bahilio and Abnahab, I think their names were. But these were the men who hewn the beams and molded the goblets, and they crafted the temple. And I similarly am a craftsman, a communications craftsman. I can't impart a vision to these great men of God, but I help them, whatever their vision, to facilitate that through the media. Several years ago, the New York Times magazine did a story about what we do, and I really hesitated to do that because my job isn't to be the story. My job is to facilitate the story. And the example I discussed with my wife was 2 men in the Old Testament who held up the arms of Moses during a great battle as the children of Israel were fighting one of the other armies. And whenever Moses would lower his arms, the children of Israel would lose. But when he would raise his arms, they would win. So 2 guys got there and held up his arms. That's my job, is to hold up the arms of the men of God and helping them to perhaps hone a message, helping them understand what the focus or the direction of an article would be, and helping them do triage because they're all limited resources. And in that regard, we don't represent them to the media. We have to represent often the media to them. It's not a matter of saying, Dr. Graham or Rick Warren, here are 20 great things you can do. It's to say, okay, he's going to be able to do 6 this week or this month. What are the best ways for him to get his message out? And when I see Dr. Graham or Rick Warren really being in the news business. Years ago, Dr. Graham even addressed a group of foreign correspondents in Tokyo where he said, we're both in the news business. You present the hard news, what's happening in the world. I present the good news, what God is doing in the world. And so my job is to help present the good news behind the bad news. And who doesn't want to hear good news?
We have a joke on this in this network because we have the religious channel, which is I call them the good news channel, and ours is the bad news channel.
There you go.
It's the,
sure.
But anyway, question for you on the televangelists who had their falls back in the 80s. Had you been advising Jim Bakker, Jimmy Swaggart, and then more recently Ted Haggard, what would you have told them before the story broke? What would your advice have been?
Well, it's kind of a hypothetical question because I wasn't involved in either of those, and there are often many things going on behind the scenes. But let me tell you the greatest lesson in PR I ever learned as a result of that, speaking from my own experience. I'll never forget the day, and I don't forget the exact date, but it was in April of 1987. I went to a lunch downtown in Dallas to hear a speaker, so I got back late, about 2:30. And I had a message on my desk to call Charles Shepard from the Charlotte Observer. And the message was a comment from Billy Graham that Jim Baker had just stepped down from PTL and that Jerry Falwell had taken over. And I have to admit, I didn't even call the guy back. I thought it was a college buddy pulling a joke. It was so absurd. I figured he'll call me back. About an hour later he did, and it was the reporter. He said, no, this is serious, because it was the day before the story broke. Mr. Baker had talked with the Observer, and they had given him 24 hours to talk with his staff in exchange for an exclusive, and so they were trying to get their ducks in a row to break the story the next day. So I called Dr. Graham and I explained what had happened, and it was hard for him, as it was me, to put together what was going on. But his comment was, tell them it's very sad. And then he said, no, change that. He said, say, if it's true, it's very sad. Now think about that. That's a year's worth of PR 101 in one conversation, because all he knew about that story was what the reporter told us. And so we were responding not to the story, but to what we were told the story was. I'll never forget that. In the end, Mr. Graham went on to not make any comment for 2 years because he was not a part of that. He was getting his news from the media on an evolving story that continued to change. But when it finally was over and Mr. Baker went to prison, he made a statement, and then as soon as he could, went up and visited Jim Baker, had prayer with him, and ministered to him personally.
But is the first impulse, should it be as an advisor, get the story out on your own terms, or do you hunker down and try to get it from getting into the public light?
I think that engaging the media is a risk, but it's a risk worth taking. And the problem is bad news does not go away, and you really need to get, and as I say, I don't have any specifics for those particular situations, but we get involved with a lot of crisis communications. And you have to get out ahead of bad news, and you have to tell the truth. But ultimately, you have to look at who your publics are, because if you're a Christian ministry, whatever the situation is, you have internal publics, donors and employees, first of all employees, then donors and people who have supported your ministry, even before the media and the general public. And I think one of the principles is to create ownership. You have to talk to people who need to know, the employees and the donors, people who will be speaking out on this, including critics, and identify these concentric circles of who your audience are, and creating a plan of messaging that includes them all in a way that helps to contain a story but tells the truth. The problem is, many times in a crisis situation, organizations or individuals are defined by other people, and whenever possible, it's always good to define yourself, tell your own story. And of course, it depends on the crisis too. There's imploding crises, there's evolving crises, there's crises that affect a product or a service like Tylenol, but the company is good. There's product stories like Enron, where the company is bad, and I don't want to say Enron is bad, but where it affects the company rather than the product. And so it's difficult to make a global statement, but all that has to be taken into account in advising what to do.
Okay, we'll continue the conversation in just a moment with Larry Ross. We're back with Larry Ross, continuing our conversation. So again, Larry, back to the earlier point. Is it the case that the ones that fell away in the televangelist community, they were the bad apples, or are there others that just had better sort of experts around them, or were able to tamp it down? Or I mean, you see behind the scenes, not of your clients only, but just in general. What is that group of people like?
Well, you know, what's interesting to me is the story of a faithful evangelist is like the successful takeoff and landing of an airplane. We're about, what, a mile or two away from John Wayne Airport here in this studio, here in Orange County, California. And there will probably be 800, 1,000 planes take off and land every day today. That's just not news. That happens every day. If one of those planes were to crash, however, that's a story. And depending, the bigger the plane, the bigger the story. So what we saw in the mid-'80s, what we've seen in other instances since, is the crash of an airplane, a ministry airplane, using a metaphor, extending that metaphor. And I think that what is often overlooked and not understood, or perhaps not of interest to the media, is the hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people, pastors, faithful missionaries around the world who are doing what God has called them to do. It's just not news. And so we hear about the ones that perhaps flamed out, but that doesn't discount. It's easier for people to say, "Well, I've been let down by so many Christians. I'm not going to be a believer." But what I have to do is I have to say, evaluate or realize that God is working through each of us as humans, despite our humanity, helping us to fulfill His work here on earth. And to me, that's a great privilege. And I'm just grateful that God has given us an opportunity to be so close to some of these great men of God and people in ministry that we're able to see them in their humanity and assist them in helping to go out and even be more effective using cost-effective tools of the media that are available to them.
Now, you've also done a lot of movies over the years. What has that been like? What was that experience like?
You know, I tell you, one of the most exciting things that we've had an opportunity to be involved with are these faith and family films. And when you consider that the average teenager sees 50 movies a year, it's one a week on average. Filmmakers like Mel Gibson and others, Steve McAvity, are the new high priests of our culture. You go by a multiplex on any given Sunday, the parking lot's full. That's where some people would essentially go to church, if you will. It's where their values are formed. And you know, you and I have had a lot of discussions about politics through the years, but in reality, entertainment is upstream from politics and influences the political. By the time it gets to where laws are made, those values have already been formed. And so what a powerful force. I saw a movie this past week called Bella. I don't know if you've seen it. Steve McAvity was the co-producer of The Passion of the Christ, went on to be the executive producer of this film. It's a low-budget film, but deals with a topic of our time. I won't give it away, in such a powerful way. And to me, people who would never go to church with you will happily go to a theater with you. And what I find interesting is the continuum and the progression of films through the years. Back in the 50s, Dr. Graham was one of the few people making faith and family films. They always ended up at a Billy Graham crusade, people going forward and making a faith commitment. Then we went through this period where they were apocalyptic, and they were marketed that it's your Christian duty to go see this film. It's nonsense. You go see a film because it tells a great story. Now the evangelism, the spiritual impact happens not on the screen, but over coffee as you discuss the questions generated by the film with the person you may have gone to. So it's less the answers given than the questions generated that really makes the impact.
Now, when you were a kid, in looking back over your life, what do you think was already percolating in your mind? Were you handling PR in the 6th grade for your friend Steve? Were you already preparing for this path? Do you feel like you were on a trajectory?
No, I am the poster child for a liberal arts education. I'm the poster child for suiting up and showing up and let God do the rest. I was a biology and economics major in college. I was, first of all, pre-med, and in my senior year I woke up and realized I hated what I was studying. So I took 11 out of the 12 required economics courses to be a double major, and fell into PR just by default, and got hired over an ice cream cone my first job. My brother was offered a job, and he was working part-time at a place, and he said, "I can't do it, I'm going to school." Called to my brother, and that put me on this path. And every job I've ever had has hit me over the head. Every client we've ever had since we took what my wife calls a bungee jump for God 13 and a half years ago, we just stepped out in faith. Every client except one, we've only gone after one client in our whole time, and we didn't get it until about 10 years later. It's all been by referral, and I could just see God's providence in our lives as we just suit up and show up and let Him do the rest. Several years ago, I was telling you about this New York Times magazine writer who called and wanted to do a story about Christian public relations and focus on what we do. And initially I was concerned, didn't know if that's something I should do, and I was telling this story about holding up the arms of God as what we do, and thought that we're not the story. But then my wife said, well, those two guys in the story, they're part of the story. And I realized, I guess we are. So I went ahead and did it. But I was concerned that I said, if this is let's go to the zoo and visit the Christian cage, I'm not interested. She said, no, I want to get inside your world. And like you, she said, I didn't realize that ministries and people like Mel Gibson would do PR for Christian projects. I want to find out more about that. So to be a part of, to have a professional involvement in ministry and be able to serve God through our work, to me is very exciting, and it's a responsibility that I take very seriously, because I realize that when I'm talking to a media reporter, I may be the only person of faith they ever talk to or will talk to for a while. And so I'm not just representing Billy Graham or Rick Warren or whomever I'm talking to that reporter about. I'm essentially representing the Christian faith. And so it's not just about doing right things, it's about doing things right. And so we're very careful that when we're doing triage for media, we don't just take the one that's the best. We're fair, and if they come in and they came in first, we have to consider that. And because everything we do is a reflection not only on our clients, but on the Christian faith.
You're behind the curtain, in front of the curtain. What would our viewers be surprised to know about some of the people you work with or work for?
I think that they would be surprised to know how real they are, genuine they are. This isn't, I'll give you an example. This reporter from the New York Times, I found out after the article came out that she talked to a number of people I work with, and clients and other people in the industry, and was trying to get a handle on who is this guy. He prays before he has meals, and she, I think, initially assumed I was shining her on, and they said, no, that's really who he is. And so I think they would be surprised to see that the people who are in the spotlight, they live their lives that way, and that it's just a continuation of how they live their personal life. That they're fun people to be around, a great sense of humor, and this isn't all nose to the grindstone, but they're real people and they're authentic. A colleague of ours that we worked with traveled with Mel Gibson to a convention of internet organizers in San Antonio a couple of years ago, and after they showed the screening, Mel got up to speak, and 2 minutes into his speech, the fellow told him to sit down. He said, everybody that comes here, they put their best foot forward. He called our colleague up and he said, I want you to tell us what Mel's like to travel with. And as he grilled him for a half an hour on, does he get mad when he's on the road and things? That's what people want to know. And so I think that a lot of people will ask me, what are these people really like? And it's, I'm glad to be able to say that their consistency and who they are publicly and privately.
We'll be back in a moment with Larry Ross. Stay tuned. We're back with Larry Ross for one final segment. Larry, what's family life for you like back in Texas?
My wife and I have 3 boys, 19, 17, and 12. I'm 6'8". I have a 17-year-old who's 2 inches taller than I am. He passed me up when he was just barely 16. And bless his heart, he told me a year ago, he said, Dad, I want to make a t-shirt that says, I'm 6'9", the weather's fine, no, I don't play basketball. Our 2 oldest boys are really into musical theater and want to pursue that professionally. My wife grew up on the mission field, and her folks were missionaries in Brazil, so she speaks fluent Portuguese, and is really, it's a team effort what we do. While her primary responsibility is in the home, she's a big part of what decisions that we make as a company, and has her own personal ministry and worship and arts and women's ministry in our church. And as I said, we have this agency, has been referred to as an eponymous agency, A. Larry Ross Communications, and have about 15 or 16 folks that all cut their teeth on the corporate and agency world, but are working on our team because of the added fulfillment of having an involvement in ministry.
And you must have a book in you somewhere.
Well, I was telling someone recently that I'm writing my first book. I have the page numbers done. I'm up to about 500, and I'm feeling pretty good about that. I actually do have a book, and I'm talking to some folks about the opportunity to get that track to run on, but talking about several books. The first one I would write, I think, would be about the role of media in ministry.
And how about an autobiographical work? Anything about the stories that you've seen over the years and all the work you've done?
Yeah, I've recently been impressed with the power of story, and I started putting together a list of all of the anecdotes that I've had through the years, and I guess I unfortunately didn't diary much, but I spoke to a men's group recently, and actually it was a couple of years ago now, and a week before I asked the guy what he wanted me to talk about. He said, we want to know what kind of shorts Billy wears. And this is before the Clinton boxers and briefs, and I said, well, I can't do that. And he said, well, we just want some stories about Billy Graham. And I thought, well, I can't tell gratuitous stories about Dr. Graham, but I thought about it, and I made a list of a baker's dozen of character traits that I've observed in Dr. Graham that are reflective of what all of us should be doing as people of faith. And so I shared those, and I realized, those are just a sampling of all the things I've observed through the years that there might be an opportunity to put those. It's just a matter of time, though, and the tyranny of the urgent seems to get in the way of the important.
Well, what is the secret of his success? Why is it that he's been able to manage all these relatively scandal-free years?
I think that there's two things I've observed. One would be his faithfulness to his calling. Despite opportunities to get involved in politics and films and what have you, Dr. Graham, Apostle Paul in the New Testament said, "This one thing I do," and this thing of preaching the gospel and preaching it, simple enough that a child can understand it, and yet profoundly enough that people world over are confounded by its wisdom. The second, I would say, is authenticity, and that he is just authentic in his character and his integrity. People ask me, when you and I were working with Mel Gibson, what's it like to go from a spiritual icon to a cultural icon? And I said that actually I would sum up both men with the same word, authenticity. They're two different men called to with two different callings in their crafts, but both are authentic. And in your conversations with Mel Gibson, that what you see is what you get. And I think that as I've observed, Dr. Graham, I've heard him preach hundreds of sermons, I guess. And while those sermons have been a blessing to me spiritually, his life has been an example to me personally of what God can do to someone who's totally yielded to Him. And I think that we've lost that in the fast-paced culture that we have today. People who, life, I've learned, is not a sprint; it's a marathon. And at 89, looking back on faithfulness and authenticity, that really has been an example to me. And I really feel, Mark, that the 26 and a half years I've had with Dr. Graham has been boot camp. It's been a gas, as we used to say. But as incredible as that's been, I can't wait to see what is in store next, because I feel like it's just been in training for something else down the road.
But it must be frustrating for you to watch public figures. You're at home, feet up, watching evening news, and you're thinking, oh, I could help that guy or that woman in this way. That's got to be a thought that goes through your mind from time to time. Well,
it does, and as I say, we've really tried to be, I recognize that I'm a steward of the experience and the expertise that God has given me, and particularly when it comes to ministry. If there's a scrappy little ministry out there that is doing what is faithful to what they've been called to do, and there's a media component, we feel duty bound to help. My wife was asked recently, what kind of clients do you represent? And she said, anybody that's going to be in heaven, will be in heaven with one day. Well, at first you say, well, that's a weird answer, but as I thought about it, it's really interesting. Within the Christian community, some of your viewers out there who may not be able to relate to this on a personal level may look at Christians as monolithic, but there are many different strands, even among the evangelical wing of the Christian community. And whether you're Pentecostal or charismatic or fundamentalist or whatever, I think God in his sense of humor is going to put people who had a hard time getting along down here right next to each other for all of eternity. And so I look at it as that we're like Baskin-Robbins, 31 flavors. Now we represent ice cream. If it's sherbet, we don't do sherbet, but we do ice cream. And you know, everybody likes chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry. You know, there are ministries that are pretty much universal in their appeal. Pistachio, that's an acquired taste. And some of our clients, they don't want to get any pistachio on their chocolate scooper. Some don't even want to be in the same case as pistachio. So we have to kind of sort that out. And fortunately, our criteria has been, because of the identification with Dr. Graham as his spokesperson for so many years, whether or not a particular client would be compatible with Mr. Graham. And that's, I think, helped keep us in line with clients that we should or shouldn't be representing. Is there one public figure you would like to work with if you had the chance? Wow, that's a good question. I've never really thought about it. There are a lot of public figures that I greatly respect, and I think that, as we were chatting before the show, as I look at Dr. Graham in the twilight of his career and really having opportunity to climb the mountain with him, I'm looking across the range, looking at other mountains to climb. And I see that the political process is the one thing that mirrors what we've had to do on the Christian side in terms of addressing issues and putting together events and so many other things. So it may be that something on the political realm would fall into that category. Let me just say this, if we have enough time, and depending on when your viewers are watching this, I don't know if it'll be before or after the election, but I'm very intrigued and encouraged by the current presidential electoral process in the United States. In 2004, there was this phenomenon of the values voter. And if you remember, people were voting values on the same-sex amendment, marriage amendment and other things. It was bringing people who hadn't perhaps even voted before out to the polls. And in 2006, people said, well, where's that values voter? And I think the values voter became the integrity voter. They weren't voting so much the issues now, they were voting for the character of the candidate. Now in 2008, we've gone from values to character to faith, as all of the candidates, including some of the Democratic candidates who heretofore had not been as inclined to share their faith, are talking about the importance of faith. And to me, that's encouraging. It's brought that dialogue about faith farther into the public square, and I think that it has given the evangelical, the Christian voter, more of a voice, and it'd be interesting to see where all that goes in the days ahead. So I would say it probably would be someone on the political landscape that for whom we could apply some of the skills that I've had the opportunity to hone through the years for Dr. Graham and others in ministry.
Larry, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.
Well, thank you for joining us as well, and please join us for another edition of the Bully Pulpit Show next time. Until then, I'm Mark Joseph. We'll see you then.